the risk is kind of still placed on the worker, or on the person who has the least power to change things, right? And we sort of say like, well, we'll just watch you super closely and make sure you're doing all the things you need to be doing. But that again, like doesn't change the fact that the things that they are told to do, and sometimes companies tell them to do it, right? Like many times in my research, a company would pressure a driver, would tell a driver like, yeah, you shouldn't break the rules, but also like we need this stuff to move. So you sort of put drivers between a rock and a hard place where, they're not able to make a living and they're doing this work that we tell them is really valuable, but we don't show them is really valuable by paying them for it. And then, yeah, we add this monitoring on top of that, which, I think many people are subject to more workplace monitoring than they used to be, but like truckers are really subject to it. Like it's pretty intense, the kind of scrutiny that they find themselves under. And a lot of us just wouldn't stomach it. And in trucking, actually, the folks who are the least likely to be okay with it are the safest drivers, right? Like the people who've been doing it for years or decades at a time. And, like they're used to doing it their way, right? Like they're professionals, and you tell them like, guess what? We're going to like watch your eyelids now and tell you when you're too tired to drive. Like those are exactly the people you want behind the wheel. You want to be next to that truck on the highway. And those are the folks who are leaving because they're like, why should I do this? Like, why am I doing this?
Naturally.
Right.
What are some of the ways that the companies that aggregate this information, and that's a lot of information on your employees, um, did they sell it? What do they use it for outside of the ascribed purpose?
Yeah, they have all kinds of things that they do. So, one thing that they do is the kind of like predictive analytics or workplace analytics that we see a lot of different companies doing. So, before there was really no way to know like who is the best trucker. Like that doesn't even really make sense. Now, like it still doesn't make sense, but like now we can score truckers, like a lot of truckers get these scorecards that are issued like via this digital monitoring that give them some score. Oftentimes the companies all have different ways of doing it, but like a common thing is how much fuel they're using because that drives costs up. So they're really concerned about that. So they get some, like employee of the month sort of thing, or they get ranked, like several companies I talk to will rank drivers and show them the rankings or give them some little gift card or something if they are the most fuel efficient or they have the best safety record or whatever it is. And that is like, again, something a lot of workplaces do, but it's just so new in trucking, right? It really changes the way that truckers think about the independence of their work. And then another thing that companies do is they'll try to make predictions. So sometimes they'll try to predict, which driver is going to leave, or like I had one guy tell me like, oh, if the driver starts his days later, that might be a sign he's like going through a divorce or something, right? Like they try to like look for kind of big data insights, when like they could just talk to the drivers, right, and find
Yeah.
out if they're doing okay. But then, business analytics, and then there's also kind of are data grabs by third-party companies. So insurers, of course, are interested in all this data about truckers and where they are and how they're driving. There are other companies that try to sell like parking spots, for example, right? Like truckers need to be able to reserve parking spots to sleep. And there are companies that will sort of use this data from the logging that we now have about all these drivers around the country to kind of price out parking spots and like, allow truckers to reserve those spots, things like that, right? So there's a lot of value to be derived from this data, but like very little of that value is actually seen by the workers themselves.
Right. And you also just speak about how the truckers in this case are canaries in the coal mine for larger electronic surveillance in other industries, and I'm hoping we can zoom out and talk about that as well. I think
Mm-hmm.
Amazon and their proposal for zapping bracelets if you're too idle made the rounds in the news. But there are
Mm-hmm.
keystroke trackers at office jobs. If you're typing, you got to be typing a sufficient amount of time, etc. This is happening in many different sectors.
Yeah, yeah.
Throughout your research, what were some of the examples you found in the trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's, especially post-pandemic and kind of the new work landscape that involves more hybrid work, these things are just rolling out like crazy in all kinds of industries. You mentioned warehouse work, factories, like a lot of what people think of as blue collar labor have dealt with these things for a long time, but they're also rolling out across kind of more professionalized industries like medicine and law and finance and things like that. So they really are sort of coming for everyone. There was a New York Times article not long ago about productivity tracking. And one of the examples, one of the people that they talked to who was subject to this kind of gamification of their labor was like a hospice chaplain who got some number of points for like how many visits she made to dying people. I mean, it was just like a wild example.
Chaplain?
It was, yeah. It's like someone who tends to people as they're dying.
You gotta measure the chaplain's productivity. I mean,
like how many points was that worth? So
how many God points?
So, I really think you're hard pressed to find industries or professions that aren't facing this in some way. And, I think it's definitely something to continue to be on the lookout for. It's also important to recognize that like there's a long history to this stuff. So the goals of management are not that different today than they were, 100, like in the Industrial Revolution, right? Like workers have been monitored and watched for the sake of productivity or efficiency for decades or centuries, right? But there are some things that are changing now, including, reaching out to kind of new workplaces, right? So truckers, you couldn't have done this kind of work 20 years ago, because like if a trucker wanted to talk to their manager, they would go to the payphone when they felt like it and call the dispatcher, right? Like there was no knowing what they were doing most of the time. And then the types of analytics that companies will sort of run, especially predictive analytics, to try to make predictions about like what their workers are likely to do. Those are fairly new developments. And another thing I think has been really interesting, actually a student told me about this, is the use of companies keeping an eye on what their workers are doing, either on social media or like on LinkedIn, to kind of get a sense for like, are they planning on leaving, or are they sprucing up their resume, something like that, which I think potentially crosses a line into the kind of thing that an employer really ought not to do. But we see more of those types of things too, services that are marketed to big companies saying like, oh, now we'll keep an eye on your employees' LinkedIn profiles so you can get a sense for whether they're going to leave, stuff like that. So it is a really pervasive phenomenon, and truckers are maybe kind of at the bleeding edge of some of the things we're seeing.
What do you feel that there's a role for some of these like major consulting firms in pushing these practices on these companies? Like I could see a place like McKinsey aggregating this information and spreading it throughout different sectors just because they're hired guns, and they'll be like, look at how they cut costs, or look at how they monitor their labor in this way. Yeah,
I think that's a smart point. I think there is always a desire to quantify and measure what people are doing. And oftentimes what we fail to kind of account for is that like some things are just hard to measure, right? So you can pretty easily measure how many emails somebody sends, or like how many minutes they have a document open or whatever. Like you can figure that out. But you can't as easily track whether, you have a really meaningful conversation with your colleague, or you have some great idea, or whatever it is, right? Like things that are actually probably more meaningful about work are, they're just harder to measure. And that doesn't often stop us from still, kind of like wanting to spit out some number or some score for people, right? And I think you're right that is kind of in alignment with the managerial consulting perspective on the world. But it's just a poor fit for a whole bunch of different kind of work, including trucking work, and just a whole bunch of different industries folks are in. I think you'd actually be hard pressed to find an industry where like you could easily like enumerate all of the things they do and just count them, right? Like there's a lot of kind of soft work or wiggle room around the tasks that people do that is really important, but it's hard to track.